So thank you very much, Glenn, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kat. Thank you for that introduction. And I have to say, I'm glad to get up in time for the last panel. That was very much worthwhile, worth getting up earlier in my time. I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this discussion. I felt a little lonely working on ecomuseums on this side of the pond. So to hear what's been happening on that side of the pond has been quite exciting. I'll share my slides here. Hopefully this comes up.
Yeah, we can see it. Perfect.
Great. So you're still seeing that okay?
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I'll just jump right in. My background is in biology originally, and I came to switch over to evolve in my own ways towards human ecology because my interest has always been around what sustainable development entails. And I decided at some point that wildlife can kind of look after themselves. It's really about understanding our species that becomes quite important. So I shifted the focus of my curatorial work here in Saskatchewan at the Royal Sask Museum. And for the last almost 20 years now, I've been dipping into human ecology. And the Ecomuseum model, of course, is a very big part of that. I'm really hoping I'm going to be able to, over the next, my time here, to add to some of the discussions we've been having. I get a sense that they've been very rich, and you're all at the end of a long day there. So I'm going to try my best to keep this upbeat if I can, or at least provocative, to put a nice capstone on your discussions. So the Ecomuseum idea does very much apply to my research. It falls into two main themes, where the connection between heritage and systems thinking and sustainability work. And also, interestingly enough, since the notion of evolution has been coming up, I see the emerging sustainability, this whole suite of sustainability issues that we're facing is really putting pressure on our cultures and is likely going to foster cultural evolution in some direction. And I think we're facing an interesting challenge there, because evolution is blind. It doesn't really go in the direction you want it to go, but if we want the species to survive, we need it to go in certain ways. Dealing with climate, for example, and making sure we have biodiversity is another example. So in both of these cases, the Ecomuseum model very, very much fits. So what I want to spend time is basically describing what we've been doing here in my part of the world, and two fronts, both in terms of the work we've been doing to set up a network of sites across the province, but also I think this group is especially interested in how we've been pulling organizations together to try and foster this movement. So the talk itself is going to lay out like this. I want to spend a few moments talking about context, because it's quite different, of course, here in my part of the world compared to where you folks are. Just to quickly go through the timelines of what's been happening in Canada and Saskatchewan. Also focus on the hurdles that we've encountered and how we've tried to respond to them, and where we are currently, and hopefully with some final thoughts to round things out. I'm not sure if I can see the chat, but if people do want to fire questions to me as we go, that's absolutely fine, if I can see them. Hopefully there's enough grist here for some interesting discussion afterwards. Then the context here, we are in Saskatchewan, my part of the world, of course, right in the middle of Canada, and we're a landlocked province, so we don't have any ocean coast at all. Lots of lakes and rivers, but we always say Saskatchewan is very difficult to say, very easy to draw, because it's simply a rectangle kind of squished at the top. And you'll see it's mostly prairie. The lighter colors here are open grassland, very flat landscapes. And most of the upper half of the province is boreal forest, lots of lakes and rivers. And I'm coming to you from the capital city, Regina, down in the south, right there. And the other important context here is that all of this landscape, and by the way, you could put all of the British Isles inside this landscape. It's a very big area, but it's interesting that the work we're doing to galvanize interest around ecomuseums is actually operating at a similar scale, geographic scale in that sense. But we have very small population, just about a million people, and most of it's crushed into the bottom part of the province. Very little settlement, roads, etc. In the upper half. And another important part of the context here is that this is settled land. Was settled going back as far as 1871 through a series of numbered treaties, which are shown here. And Saskatchewan, again in the center here, is touches on land that it has at least 5 different treaty agreements designed to dictate how the relations between settlers and the original inhabitants were to unfold. And of course, the big story connected to that is original inhabitants were sort of moved off this land and now are mostly focused in the little red dots, the First Nations or Indian reservations, as they're sometimes called, across the province. And you may have seen headlines. This is Canada Day here, our national holiday, but it's a sobering one because there's just been the recent evidence discovered of the number of unmarked graves, mostly children, associated with some of these residential schools. That this is a uncovering of past history that's very sobering and just starting. The numbers will be in the thousands, hundreds of thousands probably of kids who were taken forcibly from their families by the government and never made it home. They died at these schools, which have been in existence probably since Treaty 7 or Treaty 8 was signed. They're now closed, but there's a nasty legacy there that we're all dealing with. So this, and I will come back a little bit to the Indigenous perspective here, because it's quite important for the Ecomuseum work that we're doing. Just a quick run through the timeline for people not aware of it. If we go back to the early days of Ecomuseum development, of course, Canada was very quick to jump in. Lots of activity happening, especially in Quebec, I think because of the French connections with the initial idea. But the model was also applied in other provinces, Alberta, New Brunswick, etc. A lot of these have sort of faded with time, but there was interesting ideas or interest in the idea very early here. And including in Saskatchewan, it was talked about, but nothing happened back in those times. If we jump to about 10 years ago, the idea did revive, and a core group of organizations decided to really see if we could move this ahead. So we became the Saskatchewan Ecomuseum Initiative, a nice loose word. It's just something we were trying to draw attention to. We held workshops. We made sure there was a business case for, especially the role that my museum would be playing in it. And importantly, an undergraduate course started up at a local college, all about community engagement and sense of place, and how the emerging ecomuseums, these demonstration sites that were set up, were there as things of interest. And some student projects started very early in that sense. Getting closer to now, or bring us right up to now, this initiative actually became more formalized over time. I'll fill in details about what the partnership entails in a minute. But the point was it decided it was gaining enough traction that it needed to be formalized to a degree. There were further formal province-wide discussions, with including a note by René Rivard. Wonderful to have René here, who's a very early proponent of ecomuseums, as many of you know. And importantly, the Museums Association, MAS, set up the Ecomuseum network, the provincial network of emerging sites, as a member group. So that was a nice bit of recognition for the people who had decided to undertake demonstration sites. And about that time too, we reached out to Indigenous colleagues and some people who had been part of the contributing to the partnership, and asked them to reflect on what the Ecomuseum idea meant for them. So we have a statement that they prepared, which is a very valuable, has been very valuable for me, because it's not my words as the expert in quotes. It's really coming from people who live that culture. More recently, we've undertaken some specific interviews with some of the First Nations that were on that map, trying to get a sense of their concerns and opportunities they might see around heritage conservation, and again, where the Ecomuseum idea might fit. And very recently, actually just like a week and a half ago, the partnership itself has actually morphed into an advisory body for MAS, and I'll say more about that in a second, why that's significant. So that brings us up to where we are. And so I wanted to touch just quickly on some of the hurdles we've faced. And some of these I'm sure will be familiar to many of you who've been talking to organizations or funders or even local residents about the idea. The concept, the terminology is tricky. The notion of an eco prefix is often equated to environment. I found it much more helpful to say it actually refers to our human ecology, how we're living in this place and our sense of this place. Those kind of relationships are really nicely tied up in the concept of human ecology. So that's helped for me. I've found that helpful. Also, the museum idea itself, of course, is colonial and does sort of bring up the notion of dusty objects in a big stately building. So I've found it helpful to move away from that to the stewardship role that museums play. That can be helpful. And sustainability itself is a slippery notion. What's being sustained for whom, for how long, all of these things. So these things have been tricky to bring up, of course, in some of my work, some of our work. But I think I'll say more about that, why it's important to keep doing that in a second. The other big thing, of course, is government hesitation in our case. We're working with the provincial government. Well, my museum is part of the provincial government, so I'm doing this through my work as a civil servant, and therefore had to convince a lot of my bosses that this is a worthwhile thing. And when they're more committed to a very expensive park system that they run, they wanted to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that there's good return on this if my museum was involved, and especially how we were going to gauge success. And the last group of hurdles that I can see are around the cultural norms that we face. Certainly out here we have a bit of frontier thinking still amongst the settler communities. So we like to do things ourselves. If something is developed in Toronto, for example, we're not that interested in it, but we can make it our own. So it's nice that the Ecomuseum idea is so flexible in that sense. People are welcome to make it their own and put their own spin on things. And importantly, there's this notion of wilderness, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. I think it's actually one of the biggest sticking points that we've come up against. So just a little more about getting at or going around those hurdles. Of course, comparisons are very effective, and these wonderful models that have been developed over time and visuals that can really set up what a museum, a traditional museum looks like, how it works, and how you measure success versus the Ecomuseum equation and this image that it's been so powerful. That's been very helpful. And as I mentioned, we keep returning to sustainability with the good work by Peter and many others driving this home that in order to be relevant, museum work needs to be aimed at sustainability. And ecomuseums are wonderful examples of how the heritage, community heritage interests, especially living heritage interests, can be aimed at something so important, which is how we're all going to live well on this planet. So I often bring up sustainability as the key to relevance. Getting institutional support has been a big one. This is the government hesitation. Lots of meetings, as you can imagine. The feasibility study was key. We needed to make sure it aligned with current government priorities, and we have a current, well, it's 10 years old, but it's a government cultural policy that came in handy here. I mentioned measures of success, so they want a reporting that makes sense to them, which makes sense. And this is the important point here, is that it's been very helpful to have a formalized partnership where one of the partners, in this case, Museums Association of Saskatchewan, is responsible for the network. So I'm not responsible as an RSM, Rural Sask Museum person for that emerging network. It's the partnership that's responsible through MAS. And now that we've become this advisory body, that those lines of responsibility are even clearer. So that's been a big relief for me, because I've been trying to balance both sides of I've often said it's like feeding two ends of or burning both ends of a candle, working on the network and trying to keep the partnership going. Eventually you kind of burn it right out. But now that we do have this arrangement where the network is answering to one of the partners, in this case MAS, it's been a very good step. Say a few words about the cultural hurdles we followed. I think in some ways they go right back to some of the worldviews that are prominent in this part of the world. Is the great chain of being, of course, listed here, that puts God at the top and inanimate rocks at the bottom. You know, that's this is a prevalent mindset for this part of the world, and I think possibly where you folks are too. And that confers a lot of political power. It leads to it doesn't confer, but it gives people justification for controlling other people, the land around them, for exploiting resources. So this is it may be intractable, I don't know, but I think it's a good thing to be aware of. And as I mentioned earlier, here in Saskatchewan, we're still sort of frontier country, pioneer experience, all of that. It does sort of lead to, it puts a focus on the strength of the individual. And then there's this notion of wilderness, where we like to think of pristine landscapes, or if we're setting up a park, it doesn't have people in it, because that's contrary to the notion of wilderness. And I just wanted to touch quickly on that, because if we think about this part of the world, you know, it would be like the settlers encountering this beautiful empty land, whether it's the rolling prairies of Saskatchewan or the boreal forest and lake country, or these, you know, amazing numbers of bison. And that's a complete myth, of course. Well, it's a partial myth, say it that way, because what they encountered, of course, was a beautiful but recently emptied land. There's a wonderful book by James Daschuk called Clearing the Plains, which goes into how people were moved off, the original inhabitants were moved off onto reservations. As I say, it's a sensitive topic currently because of what's been happening with our residential school discoveries. But it's also very, very, very prevalent. Even this is an image of a recruiting poster from the turn of the century that was trying to pull people to come and settle the West, tame the wilderness, set up your homestead. Here's free land. You just have to turn the acres and start farming. And this notion of it being a wide open, empty space always has been just ready for you. It's quite prevalent. And a difficult thing to come up against, I have to say, is that because it is so contrary to what we've come to understand about Indigenous ways of knowing, where there's no great circle of being. It's an intricate spider web of relationships, and the needs of the collective are more important than the individual. Where it's about generosity and sharing, and the land is not instrumental; it's sacred, and when it's used, it's thanked. It's shown appreciation. All things have spirit in that sense. And this notion that process and protocol are important and silence is valued, which is very different from any political discussion I've encountered. Silence is usually not valued. But so that's interesting. That this stands as a counterbalance to what some of the cultural realities that we're dealing with here and trying to foster interest in something like an ecomuseum. And currently, we have managed a few things, and we do have a documentation and a nice resounding definition of what an ecomuseum is. And so hopefully you see a lot of good words in there that you would concur with. And there's a good Facebook group if you want to join us and keep track of us that way, what's happening here. And a number of sites are active. The first one is down in the southwest, looking at grasslands culture, especially cowboy culture and ranching history. This is also right next to a national park that deals with grassland ecology, so there's a nice mix of culture and nature. Very small community, but they continue to do some interesting things. We have active ecomuseum closer to Regina in a chain of lakes called the Calling Lakes. They're very concerned about water quality. So they're becoming, it's mostly advocacy around water quality, but there's also rich Indigenous history and current Indigenous living culture in that area. So I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that they continue to grow and develop as an ecomuseum. Even closer to Regina, just on the outskirts of the city, is a very active ecomuseum called White Butte. And they're mostly focused on local stories and outdoor education because, again, they have some, well, they're a very young community to start with, so they want to foster a sense of identity and who they are. So it's another interesting one to watch. And because it's so close to the city, the University of Regina, especially through education students, are really making good use of and establishing good connections with this project. So that's one to watch. And right in the city itself, the Civic Museum has been transforming itself into an ecomuseum, trying to take the emphasis off objects and put the focus on local stories. So that's another one to watch for. The member group that MAS has set up is just starting to be active. It hasn't existed that long, but one important step they've taken is to define what it takes to sort of become part of the group. And they're fairly loose principles, not loose principles, but they're clear, but fairly easy for organizations to check off. Sort of laid out here, and it gives MAS a way to, encourage people to make sure there's Indigenous involvement, for example. And hopefully this serves MAS in good stead as that member group becomes more active. And here is a scary slide because it shows all of the different organizations that have been involved in this, the larger partnership that we've also been operating for a while. Here's my museum as the chair of it, and there's a group basically of non-government organizations, including a number of heritage organizations. The Raven Consortium, for example, is a group of Indigenous consultants. So we have had connections to those groups. And as it shows here, the Museums Association is the one that has been carrying and feeding the network itself. And the important thing is that Heritage Saskatchewan, Museums Association of Saskatchewan, and Sask Parks and Rec, and Sask Culture all provide funding for heritage-related activities. So we've had the main funders for heritage work at the table right from the start. That's been a very important thing. My role, of course, here is to connect back to the government and to foster research and teaching where I can. We've plugged this all the way back into the United Nations University global network of regional centers of expertise on education for sustainable development. And I encourage all ecomuseums to check out that network and make connections with it where you can, because to enhance the focus on sustainability, the education for sustainability component is very active. Not a lot of resources there, but in terms of profile and ideas and partnerships, networking, it's a very, very active network. But so that's been taking a lot of our time to keep that partnership together, to make sure that we're all on the same page. And we have defined the page we want to be on, which has been very important. So the discussions of the partnership are formalized, as I mentioned earlier. There's good ideas about the sort of guiding principles for work, and that includes local engagement. This focus on culture has been very recurring for us, very important. The relevance piece, of course, and that museums can catalyze more sustainable forms of development. A more holistic approach to our notions of heritage, and that we're trying to consider all aspects where we can. And I keep harping on this, but the Indigenous perspective needs to be part of what we do. So we also have, we've done the hard work of developing a larger vision and the mission and all these sort of things that keep the partnership glued together. And as I mentioned, I'm thankful that it lasted long enough that it's now morphed into this advisory group for the Museums Association. So as this connection continues to grow and flourish, there's a place for these larger organizations to provide advice, let Museums Association know what they're aware of in a very low key, or sort of not low key, but we're talking like a couple meetings a year now. So I think that will be a wonderful transition point to have reached. And just to wrap things up, I am actually very optimistic. I've been so steeped in sustainability things for so long, it's hard to be optimistic at times, I have to admit, but I am quite optimistic about where ecomuseums might be going in Saskatchewan, because of the way we've managed to set things up, and some of these guiding principles, because it means there's many access points that interested communities can look at. They might be interested in tourism, for example, or for White Butte, their local education, maybe preservation of language for Indigenous cultures. All of this can feed back into sort of cultural needs that ecomuseums can address, and sustainability is resting on those needs. It has economic, social, environmental aspects, but it really is resting on the needs that people are trying to address every day, and the power imbalances they encounter as they try and do that. So, and just for example, I've just received a nice grant to look at a food security, to launch a food security project, looking at the connections between heritage and living heritage and food security. And my hope, my inclination is to let the ecomuseums know about this project, and it may be that local food becomes another access point for some of their work. So the breadth is a nice, put us in a good spot there, I think. And also because of what we have heard from our Indigenous colleagues about the idea. These are some of the thoughts that were reported to us by those colleagues, where it's, they're connecting sustainability and well-being to the land, to the knowledge, and to the layers of both human and non-human use. It's a nice picture they paint with this, and where they can be interested in attracting visitors if they want, Indigenous communities, I mean, if they go down this way. But that's usually secondary. That much more important is to make sure the community feels inclusive, there's cohesion, that people have fulfilling work. The rates of poverty in a lot of Indigenous communities are sobering and horrible. And of course, other features of what constitutes sustainability. And so the thing I wanted to leave you on was just that why, if Saskatchewan didn't move in this direction before, why is it doing it now? There's a couple of key points. I think in a, excuse me, in a broad sense, we've never had money to offer to these communities. It's not a funding program and never has been. And I think that has been important and a good way to go, because, excuse me, it's not that we can't talk about funding. As I mentioned, the funders have been at the table and have adjusted their programs as interest in ecomuseums have developed. So having them at the table in that sense has been very valuable. We're not imposing the concept in any way. We simply respond to invitations. If a community is interested, I'm happy to talk to them and work with them as they want. We've been very careful not to ever suggest that we're trying to impose this idea. We have the tools, where people are interested. We have these frameworks and guiding documents that can go to them. There's a lot of academic research behind this, and I think more will come in that sense. And I think that means there's something about knowing that you're connected to a larger project, that I think that gives it credibility, and it's robust. Also visibility. So a lot of these communities they don't have a lot of power, in quotes, against the government regulations, for example. The Calling Lakes folks, in dealing with water quality, have gained a lot of power because of their connections to university academic research. That's said, yes, what they're seeing in the lakes is real, and something has to be done about it. But also importantly, class projects have been happening. So we have young people involved directly with ecomuseums and learning, and I'm hoping actually one of the students who took my recent course will help with the food security project, and she's from a local First Nation. So, these things can really be very, very, very valuable. And finally, I think because of our commitment to getting Indigenous perspectives involved in this work, and Canada had a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission that produced 97 different calls to action. So many of them lead back to community development and heritage related things. So the fact that we can show commitment to those calls to action has been very valuable, and I think is different. It means what we're doing now differs from what we encountered in the past. So, and reason for optimism, and keep your eye on us if you want. If you do want to read things directly, there's some key papers. I'm happy to fire any of these to you. Especially, I would point to this one, but in Prairie Forum. Oops, the top one, because that's an entire small book that goes into the history of what we've been doing and sort of lays things out pretty well. And with that, I'm happy to close it down, and I'm always happy to connect if people want my email or phone number there, get in touch. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what you have to say.